Just before I move into talking about the artist's work, I'll just briefly tell you, there were two headlines that captured my attention in past years. One of them was in the Calgary Herald a number of years ago. The headline started, Murder Capital of Alberta, the Blood Reserve. And I've been photographing on the Blood Reserve now for over 20 years. It's just part of an annual sort of a pilgrimage thing for me. And it's undergone, as you know, it's become an extraordinarily dangerous place at this point in time, so I'm doing less photography there than I have in the past. But I did do a book on the Blood Reserve based on that headline. And then there's another one, I think in the Herald as well a number of years ago, describing some places being Calgary's epicenter of evil, death, and darkness, which also, you know, that's attractive. That's catnip for photographers, right? And they were describing the East Village. And a number of years ago, I did a book called Last Call on the East Village. So for me, I share, you know, as with many of these artists, the idea of the headline or media or contemporary event as kind of a starting point or an ignition point for their work. It's always been thus, you know, the stuff of daily life, it's in the DNA of, I think, much of the great art that's produced. So first of all, Adrienne Williams. You know, one of the things that I was struck by in this work, and she has two pieces in the exhibition, is, you know, and I don't know if this is by intent or chance or whatever it was, but the images to me really look like newsprint. I mean, they have that quality of a sort of a low tech, simple, flat, not particularly sophisticated printing technique, which I think really connects them in a sense to the theme of the show that we're looking at here, and also to this idea of sort of the reproducibility or the perhaps the oversimplification of sometimes that occurs in communication once it hits the mainstream. She said about her work, though, that I found interesting as well, was she was inspired by traditional portraiture and realism. The goal of the work is to question if the struggles endured by the leaders of our past have helped any in the wake of the troubles that African Americans face today. So her work, you know, poses a bit of a challenge to the audience, I think, and it's, as I say, just the graphic simplicity of it. I thought it really, I mean, they're visually engaging, but they also essentially reference communication and the printed page or a newspaper, for instance. The next artist, Daria. This work for me, the thing that I first responded to was the sort of apparent staged quality, and which, you know, a lot of stuff that hits the media, especially political things these days, we're looking at sort of stage managed events, and those things, I think that's one of the reasons that people are often very cynical about media. They see it as not an authentic representation of what's happening, but something that's been stage managed. And this is obviously it's a highly stage managed, formal kind of a thing. What Daria said about her own work was, my family and I were waiting to become Canadians since 2007. A few days ago on October 5th, 2015, our dream came true, but there was always a but. Should a woman be allowed to attend the citizenship ceremony, state the oath, and become a Canadian citizen while wearing a veil? So again, there's an implied challenge in the way that she thinks about her work as well. Next artist, David Harrison, and I'm a big fan personally of typography. If you know my books, type frequently sneaks in there. You know, either formally created objects or just ephemeral things like the little note that we saw taped to the wall there just a moment ago. And David he's done a sort of a literal harvesting and collaging of the headline. So his work perhaps is the most absolute literal take on the theme of the exhibition. He goes on to say about his work, Paul Clay's work has been influential. I used printer's movable type in response to headlines, and my piece suggests that we might even change headlines or invent new ones, much like Clay invented new ways of seeing. The next artist, two works, and this work for me almost evoked sort of, again, this idea of reproduction. The work is so graphic and it is so simple that it's not unlike, almost like sort of rubber stamp art in a sense, like it's very, very elemental in terms of form, line, and color and that sort of thing. And the idea of sort of lifting and transferring an image and then repurposing an image the way that she has here. You know, this one in particular, of course, that we're also familiar with. Was this January or February of this year? I can't remember when this image surfaced. It was early in 2016. She said about her work, the photograph of a drowned 3-year-old Alan Kurdi brought the horror of this biblical exodus home in terms of speaking of refugees. It reminded everyone of the world's responsibility to help and end this human catastrophe. The next artist, Isabel Porto. I thought this was kind of an interesting and kind of a subversive bit of play with the idea of documentation. And the thing that when I looked at this work, I wondered about was, you know, what is that little dividing point that takes some things into the media, some things into the headline, and then other things just kind of, as this work does, and it's not in any way a criticism, but they're just kind of part of the collective activity that happens in our environment. And they're important in that they are daily, but they're not judged to be important on some level, and that they don't necessarily connect with or, you know, link with the idea of the headline. About her work, Isabella said, in today's world, there are so many visual distractions that prevent us from seeing moments of ephemera, which I think she's addressed it really powerfully in this work. She goes on to describe her process. I photographed the LRT station, the Shaganappi LRT station construction during the years of 2011 through 2012. These photographs were re-photographed, and they engage viewers in this temporary event that occurred in our city. And I'm sort of, it's funny that Isabel and I never sort of like ran into each other, because I'm continually sort of wandering around the city. And I think that, you know, when I was earlier on in my career, at one time I had the very mistaken idea that I should travel outside of Canada to do good photography. And I pretty quickly realized that often that produces very sort of, it's like being a bad tourist, right? You're out there, like people like Susan Sontag talk about, you know, you're going out, you're consuming, it's very ephemeral, it's very on the surface of things. I then began to realize that southern Alberta was probably where I should be photographing, and then it was often stuff like real close to where I lived that was really the place where I should be most addressing my concerns. So as I say, it's interesting that Isabel and I didn't sort of like run into each other, because I'm continually out wandering around the city, and I find that, I must say, the older I get, the more absolutely astonishing I find Calgary to be. The next artist is Janine Alexander. This, I got to say, this one, I don't know if any of you know it, I can't remember the title of the song, but Leonard Cohen has got a song where he goes through this incantation. And one of the rhymes is like, who by fire, who by water. So it's a list of how you get taken down. Is it drugs? Is it sex? Is it fire? Is it water, kind of a thing? And then I thought, oh my God, right? So we've been through the fire and water here, right, in the last 3 years. And this work, so Cohen's, you know, one of his themes ultimately is that every one of us is going to be taken down painfully and abruptly by something either within ourselves or within the environment. And this work for me, and it's referenced in what Janine says about her work, but there's an element of hope, but it's big time tinged with anxiety and realization about, you know, what might be awaiting us. So she says, this malevolent looking funnel loomed over the ground. Touchdown was spotted in various locations in Calgary, including Nose Hill Park, not far from my home. Climate change experts predict that our weather will become more extreme in the future. And then she goes on to say, I'm not sure hopefully, but at least tentatively, hopefully, I hope that the future of Calgary headlines never have to report on this sort of a thing. But it doesn't sound like she's completely assured that that's going to be our outcome here. Jean René. As a photographer, I found the work interesting because I think, on some level, photographs are very easy to read. But on another level, if you look at them, they're very, very rich with sort of subtext, because they always reference reality. They're partly under the control of the photographer, but then there's the real world that always overpowers the photographer's intent. When I looked at the two works of Jean René's pieces, I noticed that if you look at the photographs, there's one interesting thing. When he's referencing the past, he's looking up. And when he's referencing the present, he's looking straight ahead, or he's looking down. And I thought that was an interesting there was an implication of heroism, realism, judgment in those photographs, right? He says about his own work, I use the camera as a means to connect with my social and cultural environment, to express something personal. The ancient ruins of Greece contrasted by the phenomenon of abandoned cement housing skeletons. Images of ancient and modern ruins that are now part of the cultural and historical landscape of Greece. And I think that's really interesting and true, right? I mean, you can travel around Alberta and see, small towns or abandoned places. But, like the suburbs being built in Northwest Calgary, they're equally spiritual or interesting places as well. John Hoyt. John's work, my sort of initial response to it was there was this surreal collision between the sacred and the profane in his work. And literally to the point that the head, he's done a little riff on a Sun newspaper box. His is blue as opposed to red, but it very much references that rapidly disappearing part of our landscape. There's not many of those things around anymore, and he talks about an early childhood memory of sitting in church, listening to a pastor who would talk about forces both demonic and angelic, which lie behind the headlines of the newspaper the week that sermon was prepared. The next artist is Larissa. When I looked at my response to this work was, it's, this sort of work is stuff that really, it could be part of the new headline if you consider the headline to be, today part of social media. It's not part of the headline in the mainstream media, of course. And it, to me, sort of referenced this kind of precarious, and to me this is, even though, like I was telling Henry before I go onto Facebook about like once every 2 months kind of a thing, and about the same I'm that generation, and that I'm busy with other stuff kind of a thing, right? But it's, there's this, nowadays, especially for a younger or more tech-savvy generation, there's this kind of the blurring of the private and that strange, somewhat public-private place that's out there on the in social media. And so Larissa's work for me, perhaps is speaking about maybe a new form of headline, the one which is a more personally created and delivered, as opposed to something that's been mediated through the hands of an editor, for instance. Next work by Olivier. He actually sent me an email too. I ran into him, and then I said, I'm going to talk about your work. He said, oh, that's cool. And then he sent me an email just so I would get it right. So I'm going to read some of his email too. So his work, when you hear this and you see the work, I mean, it's very much in the tradition of journalism, or the headline as an indictment. So here's what he sent, though, just so I wouldn't make any mistakes. He said, I could not print this work on regular paper. That would have been very hypocritical. I chose bamboo paper because bamboo is a renewable resource. The mats were made from recycled materials and the frame was made from reclaimed wood. So there's that whole thing, and it's this great dilemma, there've been people recently that have said, what happened in Fort McMurray was kind of karma. And for what happens there and fossil fuels and everything. And there was a really interesting piece in the New Yorker, I thought, which it's kind of the best thing that I've read about the piece. And the writer, who's a well-known science journalist, she talked about, it is kind of karma in a sense, but everything that any one of us does in our lives, we're all part of that sort of larger system. So, having babies, making cars, living, heating our houses, it's the idea of pointing judgmentally at anybody else is, I mean, it's a I don't want to say that it's not a legitimate response, but it's not a terribly nuanced response to a much more complicated thing. And so that, like any activity that any of us does, I mean, including the making of art, nothing is untainted by, the consequences that has for the, for the larger world and for our history and for, things going forward. This was an attempt to do the right thing. And I don't know if you can ever do the right thing in this. It's too big, it's too complicated, but I think that being part of an artist's intention is a worthy aspiration, I would say. Linda Craddock. Linda was the generous inviter, host, whatever the word is, to bring me here. And so Linda's piece, she reworked a late 1950s newspaper headline. And, I was interested, the thing that, and again, this is just, it's like random, but I've also recently been watching a documentary on Andy Warhol. And it's interesting, of course, when you look at Warhol's really famous work, you think of the Marilyn portraits, you think of the Jackie Kennedy right after the assassination of JFK. That stuff was, the Marilyn thing was taken, as you know, from a famous 8x10 black and white glossy photograph, still from a movie called Niagara that happened to have been shot here in Canada, in Ontario, right? The photos of Jackie Kennedy in mourning were shot by an American photographer called Elliot Irwood. And in both of those cases, they created these really lacerating, painful sort of, sort of regurgitating of what we'd seen in the more popular media. So the revisiting of the headline or popular media can be a very lacerating kind of a thing. Or if you flip it completely onto the opposite side of that coin, as you've seen with Linda's work here, it's very, very gentle work. It's about memory. It's about the fading of memory. It's about the fading of physical objects. It's just, and those things, the gentle sort of going away and disappearing, and the fact that the world is in a continuous state of going away sort of a thing. And as people, we're continually wanting to hold on, and we know we can't. But it's one of the beautiful, comforting things about art making, photography for sure, but all art making, is it's always motivated by this urge to just kind of hold on to it for just a little bit longer sort of a thing, right? And that's a very, very human thing, I think, and it's a comforting thing. And I think that because, of course, Linda and I, in a sense, share a similar affection and background and history with, smaller communities in Alberta, I found that I responded strongly to that. She said of her work, it's connected with personal and social memory, my relationship with rural Alberta, Canadian society at large, and again, the piece is referencing a 1959 local newspaper headline, which again, I mean, there's a little thing that was doomed to complete obscurity until she harvested it and brought it back for us. The next artist, Rhiannon. So when I looked at this work, the first thing I thought, for me, it kind of referenced more like, like a textbook or an academic journal or scientific piece or something like that. Rhiannon said about her own work, "I'm intrigued by the pattern and texture and colors of fur. The coy wolf," I was reading that and I thought, God, that's got to be a typo. What the heck is a coy wolf, right? But then I read it and I pondered it, and of course, apparently, as many of you probably know, it's an interbred species between the coyote and the wolf, and there's actually a thing called a coy wolf. Is a clever, adaptable, and elusive new species. While the coy wolf has proven to be a resilient creature, it is vulnerable as wild creatures are, and its future is uncertain. The next two pieces were by Scott Baird. When I looked at Scott's work, again, this is just a personal response, but the first thing that I connected to was this great affection, his obvious affection for the beauty of typography and sort of graphic communication, which I'm also like a huge fan of. Typography, I mean, it's a communicating thing, but it's also just it's a very, very, very beautiful thing, type, right? And it's also, if is it a newspaper in the gutter, or is it a sign there or something? It on one level conveys information, but its context and how it's been handled and whether it's respected or disregarded, those things are all interesting little elements that add a particular interest to me to looking at type. Scott said of his own work, in describing the pieces, this one in particular, recent current events, many Calgarians divided and forced to confront their own beliefs. And he says, perhaps these two bronze figures stand in downtown Calgary as a metaphor for each of us. His second piece, there's this sort of layering of text over, which adds a level of ambiguity and confusion and sort of enigma to the piece, which I found interesting. Is this Simon's work? I'm starting losing track. I think is this right? Is it? Thanks, Linda. And again, my response when I looked at this was this overt as well as implied dealing with the themes of shock, memory, and the ephemeral quality of memory. Of his work, Simon said, a young boy was found lying down on the beach, and he asks again, why did this boy have to die? The next artist is Tom Andriuk. For me, the thing that was most interesting about Tom's work was the kind of the collision between the two pieces. So it's one of these things, I never was that good at math, but I think it is true to say that 1 and 1 sometimes equals 3, when you have a collision of approaches and ideas in art. The first piece, I thought, there's almost a sort of a quality of black humor, a reverence to it. But then and I'm going to come back to this, but when you look at the second piece, that kind of gets, you're sort of thrust back on yourself because of the poignancy of the second image. The first image, Tom says of the work depicts ideas about rethinking a century of postmodernism and consequences lived in society today. A promise of invention and elegance, artifice of war and ruin, and the ruin of technology. I've lost it here somewhere in my notes, but he also references just the somewhat, I'm not going to quote him correctly, but sort of the comedic quality, the cartoonish quality of violence with the blimp, which is precariously poised to be exiting the picture plane as well in the image. The second work, Revolution, of which he says, this work is a personal response to the war in the Ukraine, symbolizes the idea of displacement of homeland, and it's corpse-like, it's crucifix-like, and of course there are references to Christian iconography embedded within the piece as well. Thank you for your attention, and thanks for this really wonderful exhibition, and for the opportunity to share a few words with you here tonight.